And related to this is the idea that reptiles actually care what their temperature is. You might think that these animals don't care, but they do. And I like to show this set of data this is a Varanus varius. That's a monitor lizard. That's a smaller relative of like a Komodo dragon, the most familiar varanid that people hear about. But this lizard has a transmitter stuck inside of it, surgically implanted, like my group does with snakes. And what we see is that early in the morning, 6, 7 o'clock, the animal is still cooling down, and then it climbs up to, like, gets in a tree out in the sun and starts to heat. So that's what you're seeing right here. And then it approaches the same temperature as our body. So if you pick this lizard up, it would feel hot to you. So that's why I don't like the phrase cold-blooded, because they are not cold. They do not want to be cold. And then they go throughout the day. They have a temperature which is only a couple of degrees below ours all day long until nighttime, when they give it up and they go back in the burrow and they start to cool down until the next morning, and then it starts all over again. And if you plot air temperature versus body temperature, if they didn't care, they would be correlated, but they're not. This lizard is choosing to be about 35 or 36 Celsius. We like to be 37, so they're almost the same temperatures as we are. So that's an important thing for you to recognize about something like a lizard or a snake or a turtle. And being cold some of the time sounds like it might not be a good thing, but it has a lot of advantages. You can adjust your temperature using radiation, conduction, convection, and that sort of thing. That's how you would do it. But then the benefits are that it doesn't take much energy. So I like to point out that if you take a mouse and a lizard at the same temperature, the metabolic rate of the lizard will only be about 15% of that of the mouse, because the mouse is trying to stay warm and just has a heavier engine. The reptile is not using as much, even at the same temperature. At night, when it cools down, the mammal still is being warm, so it's still using almost the same amount of energy. The reptile's cooling down, it's using less energy. Winter comes. For a lot of these animals that don't hibernate, they're still trying to stay warm. The reptiles basically turned off for half the year. So ultimately, the energy that they consume over the years is only 1 or 2% of that of the bird or the small mammal. And that means that they can use that energy for growth, for reproduction, or they didn't have to get it in the first place. And that means they can do all kinds of weird things. You can be long and skinny, because if you are there are no long, skinny mammals. The closest thing that you can think of might be a weasel. The smallest birds are round, they're spherical, and they never get smaller than this. Or you're a hummingbird with a heart rate that's like 1,200 beats per minute or something like that. So you can be, as a reptile or amphibian or as an earthworm, you can be long and skinny. You can't do that if you're an endotherm, because you'll get too cold and you'll die. So you can live in nooks and crannies that mammals and birds and such can't live. And you can go for long periods without food. I had a Herkimer, the rosy boa. It was my pet for 25 years, and I think he lived to be almost 40. One year, he didn't eat for 9 months, and he pretty much looked the same. And that's because he didn't need that much energy. If that happened to a mammal or a bird, they would be dead. But these guys can go for months without eating anything. So ectothermy is not that bad. All right, so there is phase one. The rest of this comes with more pretty pictures and descriptions of species. So, but I always feel obligated to give you a little biology in the background before I let us just look at different species. But that gets us to an opportunity for a break. So maybe we start again at 1/4 after. All right. Salamanders. And so the salamanders as a whole are called the Urodels or Caudata. And whenever I've done this kind of thing, I've sort of tempted to start with frogs, but actually, if you think about the shape of a frog, it's pretty derived. And something like a salamander is actually kind of the more primitive, four-legged with a tail. So that's why I start with them. But they do have elongated bodies. They have these costal grooves. You can see them a little bit here, and I'll try to remember to point them out later as well. But along the side of the body, there's kind of like an accordion kind of look to the skin. So those are the costal grooves. They have reduced limbs. There isn't a salamander with, like big frog-like robust limbs. That they don't exist. But of course this one has really reduced limbs to drive the point home. They have generally have internal fertilization, and the way they do this is the male and the female press their bodies together, and the sperm go in, or typically the male will produce a sperm-containing object, and the female comes along and picks that up, and then the sperms swim up into the female.
How do you mean she picks it up?
She actually grabs it with little folds. Yep.
Cigarette afterwards?
Yep. Usually some conversation. And they have well-developed tails, contrary to our frogs. And here's a fun illustration that compares a salamander and a lizard. And I love this image, but I realize that a lot of the text, especially for you guys, is probably you need a magnifying glass. But I like the figure anyway, so I use it. But you have these grooves along the side of the body. You can sort of see the suggestion that it's moist skin. Got scales. Don't have those grooves on there. There's a lot of differences between these. So some people think that, well, toads are a kind of a frog. A newt is a kind of a salamander. Salamanders and lizards are wholly different critters. They kind of look the same, but that's it. Well, a fun fact about salamander diversity is that the hot zone for that is southeastern United States. And typically, for most taxonomic groups, the closer you get to the equator, the more diverse the group gets. But that's not true for salamanders. They're the most diverse in Appalachia and surrounding areas. Their mating behavior is pretty cool. They have all kinds of different displays depending on which species it is. They might be in amplexus like this. They might have these dances they might do. That might be pretty dramatic, where here's the female and then the male is highly modified and showy and courts the female. They might travel around um, courting one another. But in the end, the male produces a spermatophore, and if the female wants it, she picks it up. And if she doesn't, she doesn't. So there's a lot of variability that's kind of cool if you're into that sort of thing. And in the end, they produce these egg masses, kind of like I was showing you before. This is, this species lays the eggs attached to a stick, and here the photographer, I don't think this is my picture, so the photographer lifted up the stick and took the picture and then just put it back down in the water. And you can see the little tiny larvae in there. So the first family of salamanders I want to talk about, and I really, sometimes when I'm talking about a group of organisms, I can talk about a couple families and I've pretty much got all the species. I'm going to have to leave some families out. But most of the species of salamander anywhere around here are in two families, and one of those is the Ambystomatidae. And they are also known as the mole salamanders. And these, some of the adults are like this big. A really big tiger salamander might be like that big. And actually we have one over there, Sal, the tiger salamander. He may already be out because he feels the vibration in the room and he thinks he's going to be fed. And so he's coming out looking for stuff.
Yeah, his little head was sticking out.
Yeah, so he's kind of like always on the lookout to see if there's a earthworm coming his way. But he's a tiger salamander. They're called mole salamanders because they spend most of their life underground. And so they start out as larvae. They metamorphose. They crawl out into the woods or into the grasslands. They grow for years, and then they come back late winter, mate, lay eggs, go back where they came from. So their time in the wetlands is really brief. Really, most of their life is underground. And an interesting tale I can tell you about that is that we were researching the usefulness of artificial hibernacula to move snakes from one area to another for conservation purposes. And while my team was building those, they dug a hole that was 7 feet down into the ground, and while they were doing that, down near the bottom, they found a salamander. So these guys are many, many feet underground, crawling around, doing their thing, and you would never know they were there.
Are they solitary?
Most of the time, yes.
And are they like territorial?
Nope.
So
They
they just
just-
run into each other occasionally?
Yeah.
And go the other way?
Yep. Except they'd say something like, "What's up?" as they went by. They breed late winter, early spring, like I mentioned. They have to have those shallow wetlands that I talked about. Otherwise, you don't have them. And most species live in forest, but some of them live in grasslands. Here's a couple photographs. Eastern tiger salamander. This occurs in this area, in areas that have more of a sort of a grassy habitat instead of a forested habitat. Blue spotted salamanders. The most abundant and prevalent Ambystomatidae salamander in this area is the smallmouth salamander. Wherever you have healthy wetlands and forest tracts that are not too small, you'll have smallmouth salamanders in them. You might never know they're there because they're underground and you don't like going out when it's super cold, and they don't mind.
I have a question.
yeah.
about the Ambystomatidae. Why is it called Ambi? What does it have both?
Stoma. What's stoma? I forget.
The whole, like,
Is it dots? Openings?
Yeah.
Can't remember. I'm gonna have to look that up, and I'll have to report back to Pam, unless she's gonna Google it right now.
No, I don't have email. Or I don't have Wi-Fi.
I might refer to
Couldn't hear what her question was.
what the prefix ambi and the suffix stoma. Where does ambistomata come from? The term.
I would go along with you about stoma because of plants.
Many openings?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, is ambi variable, or both? We'll have to figure it out. Somebody will have to ask the oracle while we're here.
Sorry, if you find these guys in like the leaf litter or under a log in early March, it's because they're breeding. Or they're
Yeah, you've caught them on the way to the wetland or leaving the wetland. Yep.
They hunt underground.
They do, or at least under the leaf litter. They're what you would call fossorial, so they're down under the leaf litter or in the ground. Here's a smallmouth salamander. These will stay on top of the surface for a little bit longer, but they still spend most of their life underground.
what do they eat?
They'll eat a lot of different things, but like insects and things like that.
What is the function of the costal grooves? Is it just for movement?
I think it's has to do with the fact that it facilitates their bending. That's the only thing I can think of for why they would have that. Their reproductive cycle is pretty cool in other ways. You do get paedomorphs, like my daughter's just got an axolotl. Apparently axolotls are cool these days. But an axolotl is a paedomorphic salamander. And basically what that means is typically you go from an egg mass to a larvae to an adult that lays eggs, and you start it over again. Well, a paedomorph lives in certain situations where the environment is stable enough that they can stay in the water for their lifetime. So they retain juvenile characteristics like gills, and they obtain adult characteristics like sexual maturity. So you'll get some weird stuff like that. And then you get this other thing that's bizarre, and it is very, very common, even though you might not know it. And that's this notion of polyploid unisexuals. The unisexual bit is that they're all female. The polyploid bit is that they're not, they don't have two sets of chromosomes. They might have 3 or 4 or 5. So they're polyploid instead of diploid. And they use the males of other species, because is this even a species? And you'll have to think about that one. Is it a species? And I'll start off by saying no, and then I'll challenge you to prove me otherwise. But there's something. But the females have to mate they have to at least court a male of a species of salamander that's willing to court with them. Because they need the stimulation of that courtship in order to lay their eggs. But they don't use the sperm from the male that they're courting with. So some species have started to figure this out, and the males, they will try to mate with these salamanders, but they'll preferentially mate with their own species. Hopefully what you're getting is this is weird. Fertilization is rare, and most of the eggs are clones of mom. And you get all of these weird different combinations of species. It could be a little tiger salamander, a little smallmouth salamander, a little blue-spotted salamander, little Jefferson salamander. So here's one thing that is sort of the implication, although I think in many ways this image is misleading, but basically you start out with a little blue spotted salamander and a little Jefferson salamander, and you get this hybrid unisexual, although they're not hybridizing generally.
You mean
It's-
it's like a donkey, it's like a mule.
Well, if you look at the genes, yes. If you look at who mom and dad were, no, because they only have the genes from mom. So it turns out that sex is not always male and female get together and you take a haploid set from one and a haploid set from another, you have fertilization and you have diploidy. It turns out there's all kinds of things you can do. One is parthenogenesis, and that's just basically you just make clones of yourself. But I won't go through this, but you can borrow the male behaviorally. You can use the male's sperm or not. You can swap out sets of chromosomes, and you get all these weird outcomes. And typically what's going on, they know now with these salamanders is what you call kleptogenesis. And so you're stealing some of the chromosomal content and then using it through subsequent generations. And so you might keep 2 sets of chromosomes and you add another set of chromosomes, and then later you've taken another set of chromosomes from somewhere else, and you have all these weird combinations. And as an example, not Jordan Marshall, but Mark Jordan, took 95 suspected unisexual females from Eagle Marsh and had them genotyped by Jim Bogart, who's the guru of this stuff, at least he was 10, 20 years ago, so that he could identify the genetic components of those salamanders. And so here's the putative species that it could come from. If it's a Jefferson salamander, for example, it's a J. Texanum, smallmouth, it's a T. If it's, I forget who this guy is. What? I'm forgetting who Embistoma laterale is. But this is the coding for the different species. 87 of those 95 had chromosomes from all 3 species. 6 had 4 sets of chromosomes. They had a double set of chromosomes from smallmouth salamanders, from Texanum. And 2, he wasn't sure. So how's that for weird?
So they're sharing the chromosomal material via their not real mating. That's how they're getting it. Or is
Yes,
it-
sometime in the past,
Okay,
there was kleptogenesis.
okay.
And then over time, you get various combos of that.
The polyploid somewhere. in
Yeah,
there is
right.
ones that are beauty, okay.
But they're not typically mating.
It's not the one that they just mated with last
Right.
week.
They're just using that guy.
And it doesn't put them at some sort of disadvantage to have, like, all the things?
Good question. And the answer seems to be no. That would kill us, but it does not kill them. They can tolerate it. We can't handle triploidy and that kind of thing.
Is there, to what end do they do this? Is this a natural selection?
Well, that is the million-dollar question, is why are they doing this? All I can say about that is that what we find with any kind of a species that's parthenogenic, that just makes clones of itself, is if mom was successful, then the children are probably going to be successful, and that introduces the question of why do any animals mate? Because then you have the cost of making males. You lose half of your chromosomes because you have to use half the chromosomes from the male. There's all sorts of arguments against sexual reproduction, but the benefits of it outweigh it because you get diversity. And when you have diversity and adversity, you get survivors. With clones, if a disease learns how to attack that clone, it gets everybody. So there's a little why have sexual reproduction lesson. And that applies here, but it's a disadvantage for the males because they've then contributed their sperm for no benefit. So they think they've mated and they have not. So it's detrimental to them. So they are preferentially looking for females, but they're not perfectly selective. So if they can't find them, or if almost all the females in an area are all unisexuals, then they will be mating with them. So that's the only benefit I can say, is that cloning can work well until it doesn't. And then it's an abysmal failure.